1, orientation for Measure Y, members, Brown Act and Measure Y ordinance.
Hi there, my name is Olivia. Is it okay we just dive in here?
Yes.
Great. My name is Olivia, my colleague Jeff here. We are general counsel to the library, and we've prepared a slideshow presentation. I'm going to share screens here, so our faces might get a little bit smaller. Let me know. Okay. You should be seeing the first slide that just says Brown Act and Measure Y basics. Can you see that?
No.
Yes? Thumbs up?
No.
Mr. Carney, are you saying you cannot see it?
I am saying I cannot see it.
Oh, you can see it.
No, I cannot see it.
Can the room see it?
Yes.
Yes. Lisa, do you think maybe you could email it to Mr. Carney?
Yes, I can do that.
Mr. Carney, do you by chance have like the camera for the room pinned? Because I'm seeing it on my screen.
You are. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Replace pin. Oh, now me. You know, I'm not very facile at this, but email will work just fine. I'll make that work.
Excellent.
Okay. Great. So maybe we dive in here. My name's Olivia. My colleague Jeff here is on the line. We are general counsel to the library, and we've been asked to give a presentation on the basics to the Brown Act, which is a statutory law, and Measure Y, which is of course the committee that you all sit on and are responsible for. I think we have about 15 minutes to talk here, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions. And of course, we are always accessible to you. We have our emails at the end here, or any staff person knows how to reach out to us. And let's dive in here. Great. So your first question here is, if you don't have familiarity with it, the Brown Act, what is it? Really, the core of it is what we've quoted here. All meetings of the legislative body of a local agency shall be open in public, and all persons shall be permitted to attend any meeting of the legislative body of a local agency. So that seems pretty straightforward, but it's also a bit of mumbo jumbo. The short is that this is one of California's key sunshine laws, similar to the Public Records Act or FOIA. The idea is that the local agency is beholden to the public, and in that vein, the legislature saw it wise to pass a law that mandated that all actions that are taken by that local agency be done in a public manner. So that generally means that there has to be an agenda posted in advance that gives notice of the sort of things that are going to be discussed, that public access is given to the meeting where those matters are discussed, and public comment, an opportunity for public comment is offered when those matters are discussed. There are exceptions to this general broad access to local agencies, and that is of course closed sessions. Those are enumerated by statute, and that is where the legislature saw, you can still see us, right? I think the feed dropped. I'm going to keep going. Where the legislature saw it wise to provide certain specified opportunities where the local agency should instead operate in closed session. These are usually things where it's actually in the public's interest that it not be discussed in a public manner. So those are like negotiations or talking about sensitive things like litigation, where you don't want to show your hand. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but not too much, just kind of an over. Okay. So your first question is, what is a legislative body? Legislative bodies are the ones that are, of course, tasked with complying with the Brown Act. A legislative body, examples that you are familiar with in your involvement with the library is, of course, the Library Commission, library advisory boards as standing committees, The Measure Y Committee is a almost unique, in my experience, legislative body in that it was created by ordinance. So that means that the commission passed a formal act, and if I'm not mistaken, was it in the actual measure itself, Jeff?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of a unique situation. Usually we deal with the leadership of the local agency as well as the bodies that they create by their own action. But that's all to say that you, of course, are a legislative body and therefore subject to the Brown Act, which is why we are speaking with you today. So you're aware of your responsibilities. So you might be thinking, well, every sort of leadership role then for the library is a legislative body. There actually are certain situations where a group is not a legislative body. We've listed a few here. Ad hoc committees are the most common ones. A specific example that sometimes we point to is sometimes the commission might appoint 2 commissioners, for instance, to interview general counsel like us, because the whole commission doesn't need to speak necessarily with every single applicant for general counsel. They just assign 2 people and then to do that sort of initial step, and it eventually comes to the broad commission to take action on. Other examples of committees that are not legislative bodies are where the library director creates a committee. Sometimes this is formed of staff or community members to address a specific concern, and then action is eventually brought to the matter is brought to the commission for action. But yeah, so that's kind of a broad overview of what is and is not a legislative body. Legislative bodies are required to comply with the Brown Act. Other groupings and leadership are not necessarily. They're always welcome to, of course.
All right, so let's talk briefly about what constitutes a meeting. The short answer is anytime a majority of you get together, you at least have the potential to be a meeting. And by a majority, we're talking a majority of the makeup of the committee at that time. And if you are hearing, discussing, or deliberating upon an item, then that is considered to be a meeting. It's important to note that it's not just a meeting, or a meeting isn't just when you meet to make a decision. It can also be a meeting at which you discuss items. There are some things we're going to talk about a little bit later, that we need to be aware of. Serial meetings is one of them. And we will talk very briefly about social media and some changes that came about a couple of years that place some limitations on the use of social media by members of a legislative body. So actually, let me talk about that right now, because I don't think we actually have a slide specifically to that. So AB 992 created some particular rules that apply to limit the ability of members of a legislative body to share, to respond to other comments posted on social media by members of the legislative body, because of the concern that either intentionally or inadvertently, social media was becoming a way to have a medium without actually having a meeting. And so it's just something to be aware of. To the extent that any of you interact through the library social media or other social media, community bulletin boards, various other mechanisms, just be mindful of the fact that there are limitations on how many of you can be communicating, sharing, reposting, liking posts by other people. I think let's go to the next slide. So what is not a meeting? Individual contacts between members of the public and members of the legislative body are not. Individual contacts between members of the committee are not necessarily a Brown Act violation. In fact, a one-on-one conversation with one of your fellow committee members would not be a Brown Act violation. The issue becomes when there's a quorum, a majority of you. There are some other specific statutory carve-outs. So, for example, attendance by a quorum at other public meetings, maybe a city council meeting, social or ceremonial events, conferences, committee meetings. Those are times when a majority of you may be in the same space. Generally, the rule there is you should not talk about any matter that's within your jurisdiction unless it's part of the program of that particular event. And those need to be meetings that are open to the public. The last point of the last bullet point on here is to always sort of bear in mind that perception is important in any of the sunshine laws, whether it's conflict of interest rules or the Brown Act. We want the public to feel that the public's business is being conducted in a proper manner. And one of the things that is extremely difficult is if you find yourself sometime in a group where you realize there's a majority of the Measure Y committee there, you need to be mindful that either some of you should leave or you want to make sure that it's a proper type of meeting that would be allowed. It is extremely difficult to prove a negative, and you don't want to find yourself in a situation where a member of the public comes to a meeting, something's written in the paper that alleges a Brown Act violation, and you find yourself on the defensive of having to try to explain how it didn't violate the Brown Act. So we always encourage you to be mindful of this particular provision and the idea of getting a majority of you together at one time. Next slide.
So as a member of the Measure Y committee, you might be called to attend different types of meetings. Of course, the most common type of meeting is the committee's regularly scheduled meeting. This is usually set by formal action of the committee. And those are at a typical time, place, and regularly scheduled. There are certain actions that can only be taken during a regular meeting that are set by statute. We see these in our line of work most commonly in land use decisions or election type decisions. I'll admit I can't think of any regarding
I don't think there'll be any,
but
that's why. Yeah.
the gist is most of your meetings will be regular meetings. Another type of meeting is a special meeting that has slightly different noticing requirements, and usually it's particular to a special topic or something that came up that is timely and needs to be addressed. But an interesting thing is a special meeting and a regular meeting can run concurrently. So the library might notice a regular meeting, realize that we need to tack something on, and then have a special meeting. So that's just an interesting conundrum. Adjourned or continued meetings, those are exactly as they sound. It's where the regular meeting is running long, it needs to close out, but the meeting isn't done. So as a sort of final action, the leadership will set a continued meeting date and time that's certain in order to continue discussing the matter. Emergency meetings are very rare. It's usually under very dire circumstances. And of course, we'll help the committee if that sort of situation comes up. And then we also threw closed sessions on here because closed sessions are a type of meeting. They're usually sandwiched within a regular meeting or a special meeting. And as I kind of mentioned before, those are very specific instances that the legislature has seen the public interest in having a private conversation, and they have to be noticed. Public comment has to be allowed before, and reporting out also happens at some times where the committee or commission reports out any sort of action taking, but those are also very content specific, and we will of course help you if that situation arises.
So I'd like to pause here and see if there are any questions. We're going through this pretty quickly given the amount of time we've got. Does anybody have questions on different meeting types or any of the other things we've covered? Okay, let's talk again briefly about serial meetings. And the reason we're harping on serial meetings is because this is an area which is easy to find yourself in a serial meeting without intending. You're not trying to violate the Brown Act, it just happens. So there's a couple of different ways these things happen. Often it occurs in one of the two types that are identified on there, chain meetings and hub and spoke. A chain meeting is like the old telephone tree, where A calls B, then B calls C, C calls D, and each time you're relaying information that you received from everybody behind you in the chain. Eventually doing that, you get to a point where a majority of you have connected with each other, and most importantly, you have relayed information about what you heard from the people behind you in this chain. Similarly with a hub and spoke, that's a situation where it might be a staff person in the middle, it might be the chair of the committee, it might be me, and there's a series of maybe one-on-one conversations or one-on-two conversations. And by engaging in those series of one-on-one conversations, eventually a consensus may develop. I want to make 2 points on this. One, having a series of one-on-one meetings, for example, with staff in advance of a meeting is not a violation of the Brown Act. Brown Act problem comes when, in the course of those meetings, information is shared among people as to what other people thought. So you know, it's fine to have a meeting at which you are asked by a staff person, for example, do you have any questions about something that's on the agenda? If you've got any questions, maybe I can answer them now, or we can be ready to answer them at the meeting. That's not a violation of the Brown Act. If, on the other hand, during that meeting, you raise a question and the person you're talking to says, you know, another committee member had that same question, and this is what I told them. And then 2 other ones also raised that question, but they had a different issue. And that's the problem. You don't want to have that sort of a conversation. You need to limit it to an exchange of information between just a couple of people at a time, less than a quorum. The other one to note is technology. Reply all is not our friend when it comes to Brown Act violations. So if an email goes out, for example, an email might go out alerting you all that there's a meeting scheduled or there's a special meeting scheduled. If you start replying all to that meeting, if everybody on the committee is an addressee of that meeting, of that first email, and you start replying all, you can see how very quickly you can have a Brown Act violation because you're conveying your communication with other people. Our suggestion on these is that when emails go out to the full committee, the committee members should be blind CC'd on it, because if you're using Outlook, at least, when you hit reply all, it will not go to those who are BCC'd on the email. So that's as much a tip for staff as it is for committee members but just be mindful of who you're hitting, who is on the list when you hit reply or reply all. And then I touched briefly on AB 992. It's a little complicated. And so that's one of those ones where if anybody has a specific question, my suggestion would be to pass the question on to Lisa, and then that can be relayed to us and we can come up with an answer on it. As we move closer in time to a point in time where the library may need to consider whether to put another ballot measure on, for example, these are the sorts of things that we'll want to be mindful of, because there's going to be a lot more interaction of people who are involved in the library in some fashion. Next slide. Any questions on this? All right. You're all with me, right? It's very hard to see. You're all little teeny tiny on my screen. So
Wave your hands around. No. Okay, teleconferencing. This is probably the most popular thing that committee members or commissioners or leadership will ask us about one-on-one. Otherwise, they usually go to staff. So teleconferencing, if you've been part of a legislative body for a time, you might be familiar with where we've taken to the term customary or traditional teleconferencing. That has been around, I don't know, over decades. And under customary teleconferencing, you're allowed to join a meeting as long as join a meeting via teleconference, as long as the address that you're joining from is posted on the agenda is posted at that location, and that location is open to the public. So when COVID came around, you can see how that kind of became a bit tricky, because the reason people wanted to teleconference was in order to protect their personal health, and they didn't want to be required to list their home address and open their house to the public to come by, and also offer an opportunity for the public to participate from there. It's like, I'm joining from my computer, do I have to give them my landline? And so from that, we recently the legislature passed a law that is new teleconferencing, which we just generally refer to as just cause or emergency teleconferencing. And this is different because there is a limit on the number of times you can do it, but there's no requirement that you post your address, that you open your home to the public, or that the public be able to participate from there. But the tricky thing is, as committee member Carney did here, he has to be visible at all times. He has to be on audio contact at all times. He has to identify everyone in the room that's over 18 years old. He didn't admit how old Rex is, but we've established he is a canine. And then you also have to give a short description of your reason for teleconferencing. There is just cause, which is allowed by right, but you're limited to only doing it twice. Or there's also emergency. I've listed those situations on the slide and don't need to read it, but emergency has to be agreed to by the committee itself. And that you can do any number of times as long as you're not teleconferencing for a total of more than 20% of the committee's meetings. And if you get close, that will help you with that calculation, or staff can, but that's just something to keep in the back of your mind, that there is a limit to the number of times you can do just cause or emergency teleconferencing, even though it is a little bit more accessible and flexible than customary teleconferencing.
And I can add one thing. In your materials, there's a 2-page, I think, handout that goes into a little more detail on teleconferencing. That's, keep that, because that will help you understand as situations arise, whether you meet the criteria and what you need to do in order to be able to participate via either of these new teleconferencing rules or the traditional customary teleconferencing.
No matter what manner or the reason for teleconferencing, the most important thing to keep in mind is that it has to be done in a way that protects the statutory and constitutional right of access of the public. So public comment has to be allowed at certain times. Roll calls have to be, votes have to be via roll call. And if there's any interruption in the feed or access, then the committee has to pause before taking any action until that's restored. So just again, having in the back of your mind that all these rules are in order to sunshine.
And I do want to make the point, because if you've operated under the customary teleconferencing rule, you'll see the last bullet. A quorum has to be within the library's jurisdiction. These new just cause and emergency teleconferencing rules added a requirement that a quorum has to be participating from a single location in the library's jurisdiction. So under the traditional teleconferencing rules, in theory, you could all be participating remotely as long as you were within Sonoma County and your addresses were listed in the agenda. But for the just cause and emergency, a majority of you need to be in one place.
Jeff and Olivia, before you continue, committee member Sarah Glade-Gurney has a question regarding 2 slides back.
Okay.
Going backwards for that, here I am, I hope you can see me on
Yep.
your screen.
If you go one more back, please.
Well, no, it's a chain meeting, I have
Oh,
a
it's just a
question
chain
about.
meeting.
That's
Okay,
good.
sorry.
So I'm just trying to understand in the chain meeting, who is violating the Brown Act between A, B, and C? Because I'm wondering if A per se is violating the Brown Act without even knowing what B is going to do. Who is the violator in that situation?
In the chain meeting idea?
Yes.
Okay, well, when there's a Brown Act violation, it is usually less about a person and more about the organization. So which we're not going to have time to really get into remedies, but if we were talking about remedies for Brown Act violations, there are remedies that basically involve having to redo the thing that was done in violation. So if, for example, you had a serial meeting to talk about an item on an agenda, the cure for that would be to re-agendize that item at a regular meeting or a special meeting and have a public conversation about it and to sort of repeat what was done. It is possible for there to be criminal penalties for violation of the Brown Act. Those are extraordinarily rare and are going to really involve situations where, frankly, the district attorney wants to make a point about something. And it's going to usually be for repeat violations or really egregious situations. So the kind of inadvertent violations we're talking about now, mostly what happens is if you are taking an action, that action would have to be redone. and there have to be a cure. And there is a requirement that individuals, members of the public who believe there's a Brown Act violation have to make a demand on the library or on the committee in this case to cure, and you are given an opportunity to fix the violation. So it's not the end of the world. It can be a significant issue when there's timeliness issues. If something has to be done by a certain date, it can be extraordinarily inconvenient and sometimes impossible to try to fix that problem. So that's why we try to not have it occur in the first place. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's very helpful. Okay, thank you.
Sounds like there's a lot going on there. The sirens are coming through the audio. Okay, agenda requirements.
Who violated the Brown Act?
There you go. Send in the police. We're kidding, by the way, in case that wasn't clear. Agenda requirements. So a big aspect of the Brown Act is that, of course, the public has to be told in advance what is going to be discussed at the meeting. So they're put on notice if they want to make a public comment or talk to their commissioner or their committee member. And so the general contents of the agenda are listed here. It's a brief description of the item to be discussed. That's like 20 words. But an interesting thing is posting requirements can sometimes get tricky. If an agenda is not timely posted, then sometimes a matter has to be bumped to the next meeting. One thing I will make note of to highlight here is that public comment also has to be taken, or an opportunity for public comment has to be offered before any action is taken by the committee, and on each action item. An exception to that is when there's consent items. You've probably seen this where the commission, the library commission, does a single public comment for all of the consent items. And then also note regarding agenda requirements is that the committee is prohibited from taking any action on a matter that is not on the agenda unless it meets either the emergency or specific need requirements that we listed at the bottom there. So how we see this usually dealt with is if it's not a matter that's emergency or a specific need, then what will happen is, let's say something is brought up during public comment and the committee does want to take action or discuss it, they can direct staff to bring it up at the next meeting. They're also permitted to give a brief response to any general inquiry, or also give announcements or direct to staff. So those are general agenda requirements and how you can add things to the committee's agenda for the future.
All right, and then the last slide we've got on the Brown Act is really just sort of some general items about the conduct of meetings. You can place a reasonable time limit on speakers, on members of the public speaking. All speakers need to be treated the same, so we need to have a consistent policy. 3 minutes, which I think is what you used today for your speaker. That is a very typical number. 3 minutes per speaker. Can be less, can be more. In case it comes up, if you have a speaker for whom English is not their first language and they have a translator, they are entitled to twice the time that you would normally allow. So time for the speaker to speak in their native language, and then time for the translator to translate. You can ask for folks to give you identifying information, like, what community do you live in, name, but you can't require them to do that as a condition for speaking. As Olivia mentioned, you can't discuss items that are not on the agenda other than to ask some general information questions. So if you have a speaker during the public comment period, you can ask for a little bit of clarifying information. You can direct them to a staff person, or you can ask the staff to bring an item back for a future agenda. Roll call votes are not typically required except when we're teleconferencing. But there are times when it's desirable to record a roll call vote if you have a particularly contentious item. If you have a very raucous meeting, sometimes it's a good idea to do it by roll call. And then disturbances, those who commit disturbances, It is possible under the Brown Act to remove someone who is committing a disturbance. It is a course of last resort. And I strongly recommend that that be the last resort. People and the conversation, the public discourse these days has gotten a little coarser over time. And so we're more likely to see people who speak loudly, who may not use the best language, who may make some personal comments. Unfortunately, that's a price of being a public member, is that you need to put up with a lot of that. You know, if there's somebody who's actually threatening someone who is, you know, really going after an individual on purely personal grounds, they can be, their time can be ended, the microphone can be cut off. One option to consider if something like that were to happen is to pause the meeting, say we're going to recess for 15 minutes. Sometimes that will help to just let people sort of calm down and then come back in. Removing someone often is, unfortunately for some people, it's what they're looking for. They want the cause. And so I strongly recommend that that be a last resort. All right, questions? Any other questions on Brown Act? And we do have our email addresses here. I think as a practical matter, because we are outside counsel, I think the staff would prefer that you send any questions through the staff to us. Okay, so did I interrupt the question?
Lisa, we've lost video feed. If someone's trying to raise their hand, we can't see them.
Yeah, because I can't do this and then go get her, and I'm not on the Zoom.
Well, and technically we have to pause what we're doing until that's reestablished. Because we're teleconferencing.
Okay, can you hear us now?
Yes, we can
And
hear
see.
you and see you.
Okay. Okay, we are going in and out of having internet service. So
It's a good test of one of the new Brown Act rules.
Can we pause we'll pause the meeting for a little bit and see if we can kind of fix it,
yes.
and then we'll reconvene.
Mm-hmm.
Jessica's trying to see if she can get us enough time in her life.
Mm-hmm.
Because we also lost.
Yep. But the important thing is we're not taking any action.
Okay.
So losing the internet connectivity and all that is important if we're taking an action. But right now it's a training. Is that correct, Jeff?
Well, technically,
okay,
technically, it doesn't really matter whether it's action or not. If we lose internet connection, we have to pause the operation until it's restored. But we have you both on sight and sound now. I mean, I think the
For now.
right, you've got a internet video visual, and Lisa, are you on phone?
So considering that the internet is going in and out, I do have a question now. My question is, if we have majority of people in the room, and let's say we only have one person that's on video, could we still do action items, or could we still move forward with that one person not being visible?
Well, in this particular case, this is almost like a law school question here. So you have one person who is participating under the new teleconferencing rules. Under the new, if this was a traditional teleconferencing, then I don't believe, I think you could continue even without that person being able to participate. But because we're operating under the just cause exception for teleconferencing, the law requires that we have connectivity and the public be able to participate remotely as well. Now, in this particular case, it looks like you've got one person participating remotely other than board member Carney. I see Helena's iPhone. But
So could we get some clarification on that? So like right now, you all can't see us, so would that be a issue?
No, right now you're okay. We can see you and we can hear you. I'm not sure if the audio is coming through a phone connection. But the Brown Act doesn't specify the way you accomplish audio and visual connection, as long as you have it. So I think we're okay to continue. You want to go to the next slide?
We're okay now, and I have a backup. I have a backup for logging in.
Okay, you may continue.
Is Commissioner Carney, you're still connected, right?
I am.
Okay.
I'm here.
Excellent. All right. So I have just a couple of slides, and we're running over our time, but very quickly, Measure Y. I feel like I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't all know, but bear with me. So just to sum up, November 2016, Library puts a ballot measure on to approve an 1/8 of a cent special transaction and use tax, known as a sales tax, technically different. The ordinance imposing the tax includes two measures, which are in part driven by the fact that it is a special tax rather than a general tax. One of those is an expenditure plan, which is a requirement for a special tax measure. The other is the establishment of the Measure Y committee. 11 members appointed by the Library Commission, charged with the annual review of expenditures and appropriations to ensure that Measure Y funds are spent for the purposes and uses set forth in the expenditure plan. So that's basically why you're all in the room, and that's how it was created in the first place. Go to the next slide. So attached to the ordinance approving the tax measure is the expenditure plan. And I have butchered it a bit by trying to give it, a few lines worth of a summary of what the expenditure plan does. The key is exclusively for library purposes to support a number of specific types of programs. Some of them are broader than others. So supporting collections, educational programs, and classes for children. As you all know, part of the use was to keep staff, to expand services, restore hours, maintain collections, serve the underserved. That was both identified as the disabled community as well as the elderly community, and to maintain aging facilities. And so last year, Myrna put together an allocation policy, which I believe the committee had an opportunity to review. The intent of it was to say, if the purpose of Measure Y was to make a distinction between things that the library had always paid for and new things, there was a feeling that it made sense to establish what the baseline of pre-Measure Y expenditures were, so that it was possible to understand then how Measure Y was being expended in connection with those purposes set out in the expenditure plan. And it provided a rationale for the allocation for major expenditures of property tax and Measure Y revenue. That's kind of where we are at the moment. I believe Myrna has had you review the library's budget for the last couple of years. That's part of your mission in this. So now we're back to the hands. Any questions on those?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Over the course of the Measure Y committee meeting, has there ever been a vote on there having been what the committee considered to be a violation of Measure Y?
I'm not going to be able to answer that because I don't ever come to Measure Y committee meetings. I don't know if anybody there would have that information.
I can answer that. We have had that happen, and we had a discussion within our meeting, and we made adjustments to the budget, and then the library took care of, the accountant at the time took care of that. And so, yes, it has happened.
Is it possible as a new committee member that I might get something that fills me in on what those things were?
It had to do with some training, that went under Measure Y, and then after we had a discussion, we split the cost, and I forget what the percentages was. And so Measure Y took on a portion of that, and then the rest went into a different bucket.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Then I think Olivia and my role is done. Thank you for bearing with us.
Yeah. As we mentioned, I believe most of your communications with us will probably go through staff, but if you need us, our emails are there.
Right. Thank you all. We will now turn you over to your regularly scheduled.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
And much as I would love to stick around for the rest of the meeting, since you do pay us by the hour, Olivia and I are going to sign off. So.
It was nice meeting you all.
Hey, thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Okay. With that being said, we're gonna be moving on to agenda item 3.2, Library Commission report.
Hi, I'm Deborah Doyle, I'm the chair of the Library Commission. Just briefly, because I know you all